My daughter-in-law inherited $55 million after my son passed away, and the first thing she did was throw me out of the house he and I had built together. She told me to go die in a dumpster. I simply picked up my coat, walked away, and made a single phone call. 5 days later, she was on her knees begging me for a single dollar. She should have listened more carefully when the will was read. She should have realized my son knew exactly who she was. The day after we buried my son, David, the silence in his house was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't a peaceful silence of mourning. It was a cold, hard, brittle silence, the kind that threatens to shatter with a single wrong move. I sat in the large leather armchair in the living room, the one David and I had picked out together years ago, and stared at the empty space beside me. Every corner of the house screamed his absence. He was in the way the sunlight hit the floorboards we'd laid, in the scent of old books from the library we'd built, and in the quiet hum of the servers in the basement that ran the company he'd created from nothing. I heard a click-clack of heels on the hardwood floors upstairs, a sound that felt like a violation of the grief that should have filled the space. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, descended the grand staircase. She wasn't wearing black. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored business suit that looked like it had been tailored that very morning. Her makeup was perfect, a mask of cool composure. She glided past me, her expensive perfume trailing behind her, and didn't even glance in my direction. She pulled out her phone and began a conversation in a voice that was crisp and devoid of any emotion. "No, the timeline has to be accelerated," she said, walking toward the kitchen. "We need to liquidate the secondary assets by the end of the quarter. It's about maximizing liquidity. The past is the past." I felt like a piece of old furniture, a relic she had yet to decide whether to keep or discard. The silence returned, now heavier and colder. I knew then that the storm was not over, it was just beginning. The next day, we sat in the polished mahogany conference room of David's lawyer, Mr. Davies. The air was thick with the scent of leather and old paper. I had known Mr. Davies for 20 years. He had watched David grow up and had advised him when his little startup was just a dream sketched on a napkin. He looked at me with a pained expression before putting on his professional glasses and clearing his throat. Chloe sat opposite me, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped on the table. She looked like a CEO at a hostile takeover, not a grieving widow. Mr. Davies began to read the last will and testament of David Peterson. The legal language was dense, but the core of it was brutally simple. Clause after clause outlined the transfer of David's assets, his controlling shares in the AI company, valued at over $50 million, his portfolio of investments, the cars, the art, the bank accounts, and the house. Everything was to be transferred to my beloved wife, Chloe Peterson. My name was mentioned only once, in a single, sterile sentence. To my mother, Eleanor Peterson, I leave my deepest gratitude for being a wonderful mother and my first and greatest teacher. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't about the money. I had never cared about the money. It was the feeling of being utterly erased. I looked at Chloe. She wasn't looking at me, but a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. In her eyes, I was no longer a grieving mother, I was a footnote in the story of her new wealth. As the lawyer's voice droned on, a memory flashed in my mind, so clear it felt like yesterday. I was sitting with David at a greasy diner 20 years ago, and he was showing me his business plan, his eyes burning with passion and fear. I had just sold my modest home, the one I had shared with his father, and pushed a check for my entire life savings across the table to him. "It's a huge risk, Mum," he had said, his voice trembling slightly. I had pushed the check back into his hand. "It's not a risk, son," I told him. "It's an investment in you." Now, sitting in that cold office, I watched the woman who held that entire investment in her manicured hands, and I saw no trace of my son in her triumphant gaze. The moment we returned to the house, the mask of civility, thin as it was, dropped completely. Chloe walked through the rooms not as a resident but as an inspector, her eyes scanning everything with a cold, appraising look. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a wall of photographs, pictures of David as a boy, of his father, of me and him on holidays. "All of this has to go," she declared to no one in particular. It's just clutter. We need a clean, modern aesthetic. She moved to the bookshelf holding David's collection of first-edition science fiction novels, his greatest treasure besides his work. These can be sold. I'm sure they're worth something. Her phone rang, and she answered it on speaker, her voice booming with newfound authority. Yes, it's all confirmed, she said with a laugh in her voice. 55 million, not including the property. I'm the sole owner now. Complete control. She said that last part while looking directly at me, a challenge in her eyes. She was marking her territory, making it clear that my time here was over. I wasn't just a guest in my son's home anymore. I was a ghost haunting her new property, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that she was about to perform an exorcism. For 2 days, I sought refuge in the one place in the house where I still felt my son's presence, the library. It was more than a room, it was a cathedral of our shared history. David and I had built the floor-to-ceiling oak shelves ourselves, our laughter echoing in the empty space as we worked. Every book on those shelves told a story, not just the one printed on its pages, but the story of how it came to be there. A rare copy of Asimov I had found for his 20th birthday, a signed edition of a new author he had discovered and loved, his college textbooks, with his notes scribbled in the margins. I spent hours there, running my fingers along the spines, straightening a crooked volume, feeling the quiet of his intellect, his curiosity, his soul. It was the only room Chloe hadn't yet touched with her cold, appraising gaze. I was carefully dusting a row of his favorite hardcovers when the heavy oak door was thrust open, slamming against the doorstop with a violent crack that shattered the peace. Chloe stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men who seemed too large for the frame. They were dressed in workout gear, with thick arms and impassive faces. They looked like demolition workers, not guests. Chloe, however, was dressed in expensive athletic wear, her hair in a tight ponytail. She looked at the room not with appreciation, but with the dismissive eye of a developer looking at an old building before tearing it down. "All right, this is the space," she announced to the men, completely ignoring me. "As you can see, it's just dead weight. All this dark wood and old paper, it's depressing." She turned her gaze on me for the first time, and there was no warmth in it, only impatience. "Eleanor," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, "I need you to get all of this junk out of here by tomorrow. The elliptical and the weight machine are being delivered on Friday." I placed the book I was holding carefully back on the shelf, my hand steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. I turned to face her, keeping my voice level and calm. "Chloe," I said softly, "this isn't junk. This was David's collection. His sanctuary. This room is the heart of the house. It's where his memory lives." I looked past her to the 2 men, who shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. I was appealing to a humanity I wasn't sure she possessed. "You can have any other room. Please, just not this one." I wasn't pleading for myself, I was pleading for my son, for the preservation of the small part of him that still felt tangible, that still breathed in the scent of paper and ink. For a moment, she just stared at me, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes that I would dare to question her. Then, a short, ugly laugh escaped her lips. "Memory? What good is memory? You can't liquidate memories, Eleanor." Her face, once a mask of cool indifference, began to twist into something genuinely ugly. The civility was gone, the pretense was over. This was the real Chloe, the one my son must have seen, the one he must have tried to protect me from. Her voice rose with each word, growing louder, harsher, echoing off the silent, watching books. "I am so tired of you moping around this house like a ghost, touching everything, reminding me of a past I want to forget." She took a step forward, her finger jabbing the air in my direction. "This is my house now. My life. And you are not part of it." Then came the words that would burn themselves into my mind forever, the words that would become the fuel for everything that came next. "You are not welcome here anymore," she screamed, her face red with fury. "Get out of my house. Go die in a dumpster for all I care." She turned to the 2 silent giants beside her, her voice dropping to a low, vicious command. Get her out. Before I could react, they moved. One took my left arm, the other my right. Their grips were like iron. There was no malice in their actions, just a detached efficiency, as if they were removing a piece of unwanted furniture. I didn't struggle. The fight had already left me, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. They guided me out of the library, my feet stumbling on the Persian rug. I had one last look at the room, my son's sanctuary, before the heavy oak door was pulled shut with a final, definitive click. The lock turned. I had been expelled from my own son's heart. The heavy front door slammed shut, and the sound echoed not like wood hitting a frame, but like a final judgment. I heard the sharp, metallic sound of the deadbolt turning, a sound that locked me out of my own life. I stood on the stone pathway, the manicured green lawn stretching out on either side of me. On the grass, looking absurdly out of place, sat my old leather suitcase. Chloe must have packed it herself, a final act of dismissive charity. I imagined her touching my belongings, her hands judging my worn-out sweaters and old books before stuffing them into the bag and having one of her hired men toss it outside like a piece of rubbish. The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The sky above was a uniform, unforgiving gray, the color of wet concrete. A cold wind began to stir, rustling the leaves of the great oak tree David and I had planted when the foundation of the house was first laid. Then, the first drop of rain hit my cheek. It was cold. Another followed, then another, until a steady, miserable drizzle began to fall, soaking into the shoulders of my thin coat. I didn't move. I just stood there, letting the rain mix with the silent tears I hadn't realized were streaming down my face. I looked up at the house, our house. I saw the bay window of the library, dark and empty. I remembered David insisting on that window, wanting a place where he could read with the morning light pouring in. I saw the stone facade around the entryway, remembering the weekend we spent setting the stones ourselves, our hands raw and our faces beaming with pride. Every brick, every window, every shingle was a memory, and now it was a monument to a broken promise. The cold rain on my skin seemed to wash away the years, pulling a memory from the depths of my heart with aching clarity. I was suddenly standing in a different yard, in front of a much smaller house, 25 years ago. David was a teenager, all lanky arms and earnest ambition, helping me fix a broken fence post. His hands were clumsy but determined. I remember stopping our work and putting a hand on his shoulder. A person's character isn't what they own, David, I had told him, the words feeling as true then as they did now. It's what they're willing to protect. Their name, their honor, their family. David had looked from our modest little house to the horizon, his young eyes filled with dreams. He had smiled, a flash of the brilliant man he would become. One day, I'm going to build us a great house, Mum, he had said, his voice full of unwavering certainty. A place so big and strong that you'll always have a home. It won't be my house, it'll be our house. The memory faded, leaving behind an ache more profound than any physical blow. That promise, that beautiful, heartfelt promise from a son to his mother, that was what Chloe had truly thrown out onto the lawn. That was what she had slammed the door on. The $55 million were just numbers on a page, the house was just wood and stone. But that promise was the sacred foundation of my life, and she had desecrated it. Standing there in the soaking rain, I felt the grief and shock finally recede, replaced by something else, something hard and cold and clear. The pain was transforming, crystallizing into a single, sharp point of purpose. I straightened my back, pulling my shoulders from their defeated slump. I gave the house one last, long look. It was not a look of sorrow anymore, it was a look of assessment, a look of resolve. I walked across the wet grass, my shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. I grasped the handle of my suitcase, it felt solid in my hand, and without looking back, I began the long walk down the driveway toward the street. Each step was a silent vow. The game was not over. She had just made her move. Now, it was my turn. I must have looked a sight standing on the curb in the rain, a woman in her 70s with a single suitcase and a life suddenly erased. A yellow taxi slowed as it passed, its headlights cutting through the dreary afternoon. I raised my hand, and it pulled over. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, didn't ask any questions as he put my bag in the trunk. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. I didn't want to go to a friend's house. I couldn't bear their pity, not yet. I needed anonymity, a place where I could think. "The Starlight Motel," I said, naming a place I remembered from years ago, far out on the highway, a place people went when they didn't want to be found. The drive was a blur of smeared city lights and the rhythmic thump of the windscreen wipers. Each beat seemed to say, "What now, what now, what now?" We left the manicured suburbs behind, the grand houses giving way to strip malls and industrial parks. The Starlight Motel was exactly as I hadn't remembered it. The sign was missing a T, so it read, Starlight Motel, its neon lights buzzing and flickering in the rain. The paint on the building was peeling, and the air smelled of wet asphalt and regret. The room the clerk gave me was on the ground floor, facing the car park. It was small, and the air was stale. A brown, patterned bedspread was stretched tightly over a lumpy mattress. A single lamp on the nightstand cast a weak, yellow circle of light. The ancient television was bolted to the dresser. It was the complete opposite of the life I had just been thrown out of, the spacious rooms, the scent of fresh flowers, the priceless art. All of it felt like a dream. This small, sad room was my new reality. I placed my suitcase on the worn luggage rack and sat on the edge of the bed. The springs groaned in protest. The only sounds were the hum of the mini fridge and the distant hiss of tires on the wet highway. For the first time in days, I was truly alone, surrounded by a silence that was entirely my own. But it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a chessboard after a devastating move has been made. It was the silence of contemplation. I thought of Chloe's rage, her greed so transparent it was almost childlike. I thought of the will, so clean, so simple, so unlike my son. David was meticulous. He was a genius who saw every angle, who planned for every contingency in his business. Could he have been so blind in his personal life? Could he have left his own mother, the woman who had funded his dream, so utterly unprotected? It didn't make sense. The numbers didn't add up. And as a woman who understood history, I knew that when a story doesn't make sense, it's usually because you're not reading the whole text. A new thought began to form, not a hope, but a hypothesis, a possibility. What if David wasn't blind? What if he was strategic? The thought was a single, small flame in the vast darkness of my despair, but it was enough. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers closing around the cool, hard shape of my phone. I pulled it out, the bright screen illuminating my face in the dim room. My thumb scrolled past the names of friends I couldn't yet face, past the numbers of services I didn't yet need. I stopped on one name, a name that now represented the only bridge between the world I had lost and any possible future, Mr. Davies. My finger hovered over the screen for a single heartbeat, a silent question hanging in the air. Surrender or fight back? Then, with a steady hand, I pressed the call button. The conflict was no longer about what had been done to me, it was about what I was going to do next. The phone rang once, twice, a shrill sound in the quiet motel room. Each ring felt like a lifetime. I was calling a lawyer, but I was also reaching out for a lifeline, a connection to the son I had lost. Finally, the ringing stopped. Davies, his voice was professional, but I could hear the weariness in it. "Eleanor," he said, a note of concern entering his tone. "Are you all right? I was just about to call you." His words sent a small jolt through me. He was about to call me. He was expecting something. I took a deep breath, marshaling my thoughts, determined not to sound like a broken woman. I kept my voice as steady and even as if I were delivering a lecture on history, reporting the facts devoid of the crushing emotion that lay beneath them. "Good evening, Mr. Davies," I began. "I'm calling to inform you that I am no longer residing at my son's house. Chloe made it clear I was not welcome. I've taken a room at the Starlight Motel on the interstate." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of shock or disbelief, it was the silence of sad, weary confirmation. I heard him sigh, a long, slow exhalation of breath that seemed to carry the weight of a secret he had been holding for too long. "Eleanor," he said, and the professionalism in his voice was replaced by the genuine sorrow of a friend, "I am so sorry you had to go through that. Truly. But I can't say that I'm surprised." My grip tightened on the phone. Not surprised. The small hypothesis that had formed in the darkness of my despair suddenly felt less like a guess and more like a certainty. My son had known. He had seen this coming. Mr. Davies continued, his voice low and filled with a pained affection for the friend he had lost. "David was a brilliant man, Eleanor. He could predict market trends and technological shifts years in advance. He saw the world in patterns, in lines of code and probable outcomes. And he saw the patterns in people, too. He knew his wife. He loved her, I think, in his own way, but he was not a fool. He was a planner. He always had a contingency." I closed my eyes, picturing my son's face, not his smiling photos, but the look of quiet worry he sometimes had when he thought no one was watching. The burden he must have carried. Then, Mr. Davies's tone shifted. The friendly sorrow was gone, replaced by the crisp, precise voice of an executor about to perform his duty. "Eleanor, I am going to tell you something now that I was bound by my fiduciary duty and my promise to David not to reveal unless a very specific set of conditions were met. By forcibly removing you from the house, Chloe has just fulfilled those conditions." I held my breath. This was it. David left me with a sealed envelope and a list of private, detailed instructions, the lawyer continued. "The will we read in my office the other day, it was not the entire story. It was true in a legal sense, but it was incomplete. Think of it as the first move in a chess game my son knew he might not be around to finish." I felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of me, grief, sharp and fresh, for the terrible knowledge my son had to live with, and an overwhelming, crushing love for his foresight, for his fierce, protective heart that reached out to care for me even from beyond the grave. "What are you saying?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Davies's voice was firm now, a beacon in the storm. "I'm saying there is another clause. A contingency clause, triggered by specific actions." David called it his character test. He wanted, more than anything, to give Chloe a genuine chance to prove him wrong. He hoped she would choose decency. He hoped she would choose family. But he planned for the probability that she would choose greed. The small, flickering flame of purpose inside me roared to life. My son had not abandoned me. He had armed me. Mr. Davies's final words were not a comfort but a call to action. "She has failed the test, Eleanor. She has made her move. Now, it's time for us to make David's." Mr. Davies's voice over the phone was a lifeline, pulling me from the wreckage of the past few days and setting me on solid ground. I sat up straighter on the lumpy motel bed, listening with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. "To understand what David did," the lawyer began, his tone now that of a strategist explaining a brilliant campaign, "you have to understand that he didn't write a simple will. He created a test, an ethical and legal stress test, with his entire fortune as the subject." I could almost see my son in those words, the meticulous planner, the genius who saw every possible outcome. "The document we read in my office," Davies continued, "was the first part of that test. It was the bait. It was designed to give Chloe everything she thought she ever wanted, but it came with a single, almost invisible string attached." He paused for effect. That string was a legal concept called fiduciary duty. It's a term we lawyers use all the time, and it usually sounds like boilerplate, but David turned it into the entire key to the mechanism. I listened, rapt, as he explained the elegant, devastating simplicity of my son's plan. The will stated that the inheritor, Chloe, was entrusted with the entire Peterson estate, but it also contained one crucial, carefully worded clause. It said she was bound, for a 30-day evaluation period, to a solemn fiduciary duty to protect and uphold the welfare and legacy of the Peterson family. It sounds like a sentimental phrase, doesn't it? Davies said, a hint of admiration in his voice. But in the context of a will, it's a legally binding instruction. Family legacy doesn't just mean the money, it means the people, the history, the honor. It means you, Eleanor. The pieces began to click into place in my mind, forming a picture of my son's incredible foresight. When Chloe threw you out of the house, Davies explained, his voice turning hard as steel, she did more than just a cruel thing. She took a sledgehammer to the most important clause in the will. She proved, in the most dramatic way possible, that she had no intention of upholding the welfare or legacy of the family. She violated her fiduciary duty. And that violation is the trigger. He told me that this breach gave him, as the executor, the full legal authority to unseal and activate a second document, a sealed codicil to the will that David had left in his private safe. As Mr. Davies spoke, the dreary motel room around me faded away. I was transported back 3 months, to the last quiet evening I had spent with my son. We were in the library, a comfortable silence between us. David had been staring intently at his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up at me suddenly, his eyes tired but clear. There was a weight to him that evening, a weariness that went beyond work. "Mum," he had said, his voice quiet but serious, "if anything ever happens to me, I need you to trust what I've built." I had thought he meant his company, the algorithms, the patents. I had put my hand on his shoulder and told him I always would. But he shook his head slightly. "No, not just the company," he clarified, looking back at his screen, full of what I now realized must have been legal documents. "I mean the system. The system I built to protect you." I hadn't understood then. I thought he was talking about firewalls or financial arrangements. I didn't realize he was forging a shield of law and love around me. Now, in this lonely motel room, his words were the clearest thing in the world. He had been preparing for this very day. I came back to the present, my heart aching with a mixture of immense grief and profound pride. My son was gone, but his brilliant mind was still at work, still protecting me. "So, what do we do now?" I asked Mr. Davies, my voice no longer trembling. It was the voice of a woman with a mission. "Now, we follow David's instructions to the letter," Davies replied, his voice all business. And his instructions were very clear. We do not confront her. We do not reveal our hand. David's plan was more elegant than that. He knew that true character is revealed not when it's challenged, but when it thinks no one is watching. He laid out the next steps. "Chloe believes she is one of the wealthiest women in the country. We need her to believe that with all her heart. But when she tries to spend that money, to liquidate those assets, to exercise that power, she will find that the doors are all locked." He explained that he would use his legal authority as executor to place temporary holds on everything, citing standard procedural delays, estate valuations, and tax assessments. It would be a death by 1,000 paper cuts. She would be a queen with an empty treasury. "She will grow frustrated, then angry, then desperate," Davies said. David knew she had no patience. He designed the trap to prey on her own worst instincts. He gave her all the rope she could ever want, Eleanor. Now, we just have to wait for her to tie her own noose. Trust the system. Trust your son. I hung up the phone. The silence of the motel room no longer felt empty but charged with purpose. The game had been set by my son long ago. It was time for me to play my part. The plan Mr. Davies laid out over the phone was both simple and breathtakingly complex. It was a legal labyrinth designed by my son, and Mr. Davies was handing me the map. His instructions for his part were precise. He would begin the process of legally freezing the estate's major assets. He would use the perfect, impenetrable shield of bureaucracy. There would be notices of probate, filings for asset valuation, and requests for federal and state tax clearances. Each step was a standard, legally required procedure, but when done with deliberate slowness, they would form an invisible wall around the $55 million. Chloe would be able to see the fortune, but she would be utterly unable to touch it. It would be like a starving person staring at a banquet through a pane of unbreakable glass. My instructions were much simpler and much harder. "You, Eleanor, must disappear," Mr. Davies had said, his voice firm. Not forever, just for a few days. Let your trail go cold. Don't answer your phone if anyone calls. Don't reach out to old friends. To Chloe, and to the world, you must be what she believes you are, a broken, defeated old woman who has run away to some dark corner to grieve. Your absence will be her confidence. Your silence will be her signal to act rashly. We need her to feel completely, utterly, and foolishly secure. We spoke for a few more minutes, confirming the details, and then the call was over. I placed my phone on the worn-out nightstand. The motel room was silent once more. I looked around at the cheap laminate furniture, the stained carpet, the thin, faded curtains. An hour ago, this room had been a symbol of my humiliation, the lowest point of my life. But now, it felt different. It felt like a bunker, a command center. The anonymity I had sought out of shame had become a strategic advantage. This wasn't a place of defeat, it was a staging ground. A younger, angrier version of myself might have called this feeling a thirst for revenge. I might have savored the thought of Chloe's future suffering. But sitting there in the quiet solitude, feeling the immense weight of my son's trust reaching out to me from the past, I knew this was something else entirely. It wasn't about inflicting pain, it was about revealing a painful truth. It was not vengeance, it was the slow, methodical execution of justice. My son's justice. I was not an avenger. I was an executor, tasked with carrying out the final, most important wish of my child, to protect his legacy from the one person he knew would try to destroy it. The plan was a masterpiece of legal and psychological engineering, but it was built upon a single critical assumption: Chloe's boundless arrogance. A sliver of doubt entered my mind. Could anyone truly be so blinded by greed, so utterly lacking in caution? The plan required her to not just walk into the trap, but to sprint into it, laughing all the way. She would have to ignore all the red flags, all the procedural delays, and believe only what she wanted to believe. It seemed like a flaw in an otherwise perfect design. I worried she might sense something was wrong, that she might hire a competent lawyer of her own who would advise patience. Then I had to question myself. Did I have the strength to see this through? My role was to remain silent, to watch from the shadows as she, for a time, celebrated on the grave of my son's memory. I would have to endure the thought of her parties, of her tearing down his library, of her erasing his presence from the home we built. It would require a level of self-control I wasn't sure I possessed. The instinct to fight, to scream, to confront her, was a powerful one. I looked at the dark screen of my phone, at my own tired reflection staring back. I saw the face of a grieving mother, but beneath the grief, I saw the history professor, the woman who understood that the most important battles are often won not on the field, but in the quiet archives, through patience and the careful study of the facts. David had studied his opponent. He had laid out the strategy. He trusted me to execute it. I would not let him down. Reaching out with a steady hand, I pressed and held the power button on my phone. The screen flickered and went black. The first step of the plan was complete. I had disappeared. For the next 3 days, I followed Mr. Davies's instructions to the letter. I lived in a state of self-imposed exile, a ghost in a cheap motel room. The television remained off. My phone remained a dark, silent rectangle on the nightstand. The world outside my window, with its endless river of highway traffic, ceased to exist. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but as I sat in that quiet, contemplative solitude, Chloe was doing the exact opposite. She was exploding into the world with the force of a financial supernova, a spectacle of consumption so grand it was almost an art-formed MR. Davies later filled me in on all the details, his voice a dry, factual report over the phone. He painted a picture of a woman so completely consumed by greed that she couldn't see the cliff edge just beyond her brand new $1,000 shoes. Her first stop, he told me, was a whirlwind tour of the most expensive boutiques the city had to offer. She moved through them not like a shopper but like a conqueror claiming tribute, handbags from designers whose names I didn't even know, watches that cost more than my first house, dresses she would likely only wear once. She wasn't just buying things, she was buying a new identity. shedding the skin of her old life and wrapping herself in a cocoon of obscene luxury. From there, she went to a supercar dealership, the kind of place with polished concrete floors and more security guards than cars. She didn't browse, she simply pointed at the most ostentatious vehicle in the showroom, a blood-red sports car with doors that opened upwards like wings. She put down a substantial, non-refundable deposit with a flick of her credit card. The salesman, Mr. Davies learned, had asked when she would pay the remaining balance. Chloe had laughed, a tinkling, condescending sound. "Oh, as soon as some boring little estate paperwork clears up," she had said. "Don't worry, the money is there." But her most egregious act, the one that felt like a personal violation even when heard secondhand, was what she planned for the house. She hired a famous interior designer, a man known for his cold, brutally minimalist style that was the antithesis of the warm, comfortable home David and I had created. He and Chloe had walked through the house, and Chloe had issued decrees like a petty tyrant. The warm oak floors were to be ripped out and replaced with white marble. The comfortable, custom-built furniture was to be sold. But she saved her greatest venom for the library. Mr. Davies's private investigator had recorded her conversation with the designer. "This room," Chloe had said, her voice dripping with disdain, "is a morgue. All these dusty old books and this dark, depressing wood. I want it gutted. I want white walls, chrome, glass, and a personal juice bar right over there." She was pointing, the investigator noted, directly at the spot where David's favorite reading chair had sat for over a decade. She wasn't just redecorating, she was performing a ritual cleansing, systematically erasing every trace of my son and of me. The crescendo of her hubris was the party she threw, a massive, catered affair 3 nights after she had thrown me out. The house was filled with strangers, an entirely new set of friends, who had miraculously appeared in her life at the exact same time as the $55 million. Champagne flowed, a DJ played loud, pulsing music, and Chloe held court in the center of it all, soaking in the adoration of her new followers. She was radiant, triumphant. At some point in the evening, Mr. Davies's source told him, one of the new friends asked about David's mother. Chloe had paused, placing a dramatic hand on her chest as if the question caused her great pain. "Oh, Eleanor," she had sighed, her voice carrying across the hushed circle of listeners. "The poor, dear woman. She was just so overwhelmed by everything, the grief, the legal matters. She couldn't adjust to this new reality." She had shaken her head sadly. "I believe she checked herself into a quiet little nursing home up north somewhere. It's for the best, really. She just doesn't belong in this world." Listening to Mr. Davies recount that part, a strange calm washed over me. I felt no anger, no rage. I only felt a profound, cold pity. She was dancing in a house of cards, toasting to a future that had already been signed away. She believed she was the queen of a new and glittering kingdom, never once realizing she was just a temporary actress on a stage my son had so carefully built. And the final act, I knew, was about to begin. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and now the walls were about to start closing in. The day after her party was meant to be the first day of her new reign. As Mr. Davies later recounted it to me, Chloe woke up late, the sunlight streaming into the master bedroom she now occupied alone. The house was quiet, the caterers had cleaned up the evidence of the previous night's grand affair. She likely felt on top of the world, a queen in her castle, the undisputed master of a $55 million universe. She decided to begin her day, and her new life, with an act of casual, triumphant consumption. She drove David's luxury sedan, a car she now considered hers, to a chic downtown cafe after a brief, satisfying stop at her new favorite jewelry store. It was there, surrounded by the quiet clinking of porcelain and the murmur of the city's elite, that the first crack appeared in the foundation of her perfect world. After ordering a ridiculously expensive coffee and a pastry, she presented her new black credit card, the one linked directly to the main estate account. The barista swiped it. A moment passed. He swiped it again. A small, polite frown appeared on his face. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice low enough to avoid a scene. "It's been declined." Chloe laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "That's impossible," she said, her voice a little too loud. "Try it again." He did. The result was the same. Annoyance flickered across her face, replaced by a flash of embarrassment as she noticed a woman at a nearby table glance over. She handed him a different card, also linked to the estate. It, too, was declined. Flustered, she paid with the last of the cash in her designer handbag and retreated to her car, her face a mask of cold fury. She immediately called the private banking line. The representative who answered was impeccably polite, which only seemed to fuel her anger. "Yes, Mrs. Peterson," the banker said after a moment. "I see the issue. There appears to be a temporary procedural hold placed on all accounts associated with the Peterson estate." Chloe's voice was sharp. "A what?" "I am the sole beneficiary. That is my money. Remove the hold immediately." There was a soft, electronic shuffling sound on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't do that," the banker said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "The request was filed this morning by the executor of the estate, Mr. Davies. It's a standard hold pending a full asset valuation for probate court. My hands are tied." Chloe sat in her car, the engine silent, and stared at the glittering storefronts. For the first time, a cold tendril of real fear snaked its way into her heart. She drove home, her mind racing. When she walked through the front door, her phone was ringing. It was the celebrity interior designer. His voice, usually so fawning and effusive, was clipped and annoyed. "Chloe, darling," he said, dispensing with pleasantries. "There's a bit of a problem. My demolition crew arrived at the house this morning to begin work on the library, but they were turned away. We were served with a legal notice, a temporary injunction on any structural alterations to the property, filed by the estate's executor." He took a breath. "My crew bills by the hour, darling, and right now they are billing me for doing absolutely nothing. What is going on?" Chloe sank onto a pristine white sofa, the phone feeling cold against her ear. She was surrounded by the walls she wanted to tear down, but an invisible, more powerful wall had just been erected around her. Before she could even formulate a reply to the designer, another call came through. It was the car salesman. The cheerful deference was gone from his voice. It was now the voice of a man who wanted his money. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, his tone all business, "I'm calling about the final payment for the Gran Turismo. As we discussed, your deposit holds the vehicle for a 72-hour window. We're now at hour 75. We need that wire transfer today. Otherwise, I'll be forced to release the vehicle to another interested party, and as per the contract you signed, the deposit is non-refundable." The sports car, the ultimate symbol of her new status, was about to vanish. Every pillar of her new life was crumbling, one by one, in the space of a single morning. That was when the panic truly set in. Her confident rage dissolved into a frantic, cornered fear. She had only one move left. She dialed the number for Mr. Davies's office, her thumb jabbing at the screen. The moment he answered, the dam of her composure broke, and a torrent of furious, terrified words poured out. "What have you done?" she screamed into the phone. "Why is my money frozen? Why can't I touch anything? This is my house. You work for me. I am the estate. You can't do this to me. I will sue you. I will ruin you." On the other end of the line, as Mr. Davies later described it to me, he simply held the phone a few inches from his ear and waited for the storm to pass. When she finally paused to take a breath, he spoke, his voice the calm, unshakable center of her hurricane. "Mrs. Peterson, I understand your frustration. However, as I am sure you can appreciate, the final settlement of an estate of this size is a highly complex process." "Standard procedure," she shrieked. "There is nothing standard about this. I assure you, Mrs. Peterson," he continued, his tone maddeningly professional, "every action I have taken is a perfectly standard and legally required step to protect the assets of the estate during the probate period. I am simply following the letter of the law." She screamed again, a raw, frustrated sound of a spoiled child being denied what they want. She was beating her fists against an invisible wall, a wall built of procedure, of legality, of my son's brilliant, patient design. After a final, incoherent threat, she slammed the phone down. She was trapped. Trapped not by bars or locks, but by the very system she thought had given her everything. She was a queen in a gilded cage, and my son, through the calm, steady hand of Mr. Davies, had just quietly and irrevocably turned the key. 5 days. According to the updates I received from Mr. Davies over the motel's crackling landline, that's how long it took for Chloe's new world to rust. The invisible walls he had erected had done their job perfectly. Her life, which had seemed so boundless and glittering just days before, had become a gilded cage. The unpaid invoices from the party caterers and the DJ were now arriving with angry red notices demanding immediate payment. The interior designer had sent a scathing email and a bill for his wasted time. The car dealership had called one last time to inform her that her deposit was forfeited and the red sports car had been sold to someone else. Her new wealthy friends, the ones who had toasted her name with her own champagne, suddenly became impossible to reach. Her calls went to voicemail, her texts were left unread. The silence in that vast, empty mansion must have been deafening. She was the queen of a paper kingdom, and a slight breeze had just blown it all away. Her first reaction, Mr. Davies's investigator reported, was a frantic, desperate search for me. The power dynamic had flipped so completely it was almost poetic. The woman who had ordered me to go die in a dumpster was now scouring the city for the very woman she had discarded. Her desperation, I imagine, was fueled by a last flicker of her arrogance. She likely believed that if she could just find me, she could bully or threaten me into calling off the lawyer and releasing her money. She drove to the homes of my old friends, men and women she had always treated with dismissive contempt, but at every door, she was met with polite, firm denial. "I'm sorry, Chloe, we haven't seen Eleanor." "No, she hasn't called." Each closed door was another reflection of the one she had slammed in my face. She, the new millionaire, was the one being turned away. She, the master of the house, was the one who was no longer welcome. By the afternoon of the 5th day, her anger had burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, gray ashes of desperation. Every avenue was a dead end, every call was a failure. She was utterly and completely powerless. There was only one place left to go, one person left to appeal to. She had already tried screaming at Mr. Davies. This time, she would have to try a different tactic, humility, or at least a performance of it. As she made her way to his downtown office, stripped of her bluster and bravado, she must have felt the true weight of her situation for the first time. She was a $55 million heiress who couldn't afford to pay a parking meter. And that is what led her, finally, to the quiet, wood-paneled waiting room of Davies, and Finch. Mr. Davies had called me at the motel that morning. His voice was calm, but I could hear a note of finality in it. "Eleanor," he had said simply, "it's time. I think she's ready to listen." He had sent a car for me, and I had put on my best suit, the simple navy one I had worn to my son's wedding. I had been sitting in that waiting room for about an hour, not with anxiety, but with a profound sense of calm. I was not a victim waiting for an apology, I was a mother about to carry out her son's final wishes. I was reading a book on Roman history, the familiar weight of it in my hands a comforting anchor. The door to the waiting room opened softly. I didn't look up immediately. I finished my paragraph first. Then, slowly, I lowered my book. She was standing there, hesitating on the threshold. She looked nothing like the conquering queen from the will reading or the raging fury from the party. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her perfect hair was in disarray, and her eyes were wide with a fear she could no longer conceal. She looked lost and small. Her eyes scanned the room, likely looking for the receptionist, and then they found me. They locked onto my face, and in that instant, I saw it all happen, the confusion, the shock, and then the dawning, sickening horror of comprehension. The realization that this wasn't a series of unfortunate bureaucratic mistakes. It wasn't a problem that could be fixed. It was a plan. A meticulous, perfectly executed plan. And the quiet, insignificant old woman she had thrown out into the rain like a piece of rubbish was sitting at the very heart of it. I watched the cascade of emotions ripple across Chloe's face. It happened in a fraction of a second, but for me, it felt like an eternity. First, there was simple confusion, the kind you see when a familiar room has been inexplicably rearranged. Then, a flash of pure, undiluted shock as her brain finally processed the impossible fact that I, the ghost she had exorcised, was sitting right there in front of her. And finally, that shock curdled into a deep, primal fear, the look of a chess player who has just realized they have been in checkmate for the last 5 moves. The desperate, pleading speech she had likely rehearsed all the way to the office died on her lips. The arrogance, the anger, the fury, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a raw, trembling panic. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, as if remembering the role she was supposed to play, she tried again, forcing a term of affection that now sounded like a curse. "Mother," she stammered, taking a hesitant step into the room. I've been looking for you everywhere. I was so worried." The lie was so transparent, so pathetic, that it was almost pitiful. She was trying to rewrite the history of the last 5 days in a single desperate sentence. She was trying to pretend she was a concerned daughter, not a failed tyrant. I simply looked at her. I did not smile. I did not frown. I offered her no anger to fight against, no pity to cling to. I said nothing. In that moment, I understood that silence was the most powerful tool I possessed. There were no words that needed to be spoken. My silence was a mirror, and in it, she was forced to see the reflection of her own cruelty, her own greed, her own choices. It was a more damning accusation than any shout, any accusation, any teardown could ever be. She crumbled under the weight of that quiet gaze. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for someone to rescue her from the uncomfortable truth. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she continued, her voice cracking, the words tumbling out in a disorganized plea. They got out of hand. The pressure. I wasn't thinking." Her voice trailed off. She could see it in my eyes, she knew that I knew. The performance was over. Just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, the door to the main offices opened. Mr. Davies stood there. He was dressed in a dark, conservative suit, his face a perfect mask of professional gravity. He did not acknowledge Chloe's distress or her stammered apologies. He simply looked at her, then at me, his gaze communicating a deep and somber understanding. "Chloe." "Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "If you'll please join me in the conference room, we can begin." He held the door open. I closed my book, placing it carefully on the end table beside my chair. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I was not the stooped, defeated woman who had been shoved out into the rain. I felt a lifetime of quiet dignity settle on my shoulders. I walked towards the conference room. After a moment's hesitation, Chloe followed. She was no longer a queen leading a procession, she was a defendant being led to the dock. The 10 steps from the waiting room to that conference room felt like a mile. With every step, the last vestiges of her power seemed to fall away. I was no longer the woman she had thrown out, and she was no longer the woman who held the world in her hands. We were simply a mother and a daughter-in-law about to face the final, unalterable truth of my son's legacy. And I was ready. We sat at the long, polished conference table. Mr. Davies was at the head, a position of calm, quiet authority. I was on his right and Chloe was on his left, a vast expanse of gleaming mahogany between us. The air in the room was still and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Chloe sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. She was trying to project an image of a wronged woman, a victim of bureaucratic error, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. She was a cornered animal, and she knew it'd. Davies began, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "Thank you for coming in, Chloe," he said. "You are here today because you have found yourself, quite suddenly, unable to access the assets of your late husband's estate. The reason for this, I assure you, is not a mistake. It is, in fact, quite simple. He slid a single document across the table toward her. It was a copy of the will that had been read just over a week ago. If you recall, he said, his voice even and measured, this document appointed you as the primary beneficiary and steward of the Peterson estate. But it also, in Section 2, bound you to a specific, legally enforceable fiduciary duty. He had a second copy, and he tapped a highlighted paragraph with his pen. The clause states that the inheritor, for a period of 30 days, assumes a solemn duty to protect and maintain the welfare of the immediate family and the integrity of the Peterson family legacy. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. 30 days, Chloe. A probationary period, you could call it. A time for evaluation, to be overseen by me as the executor of the estate. Chloe stared at the paragraph, her eyes scanning the words as if seeing them for the first time. I could see the confusion warring with her rising panic. Mr. Davies continued, his voice relentless in its calm precision. 5 days ago, on the afternoon of October 9th, you committed a profound and irreversible breach of that duty. He slid a second, much thinner folder across the table. It landed softly next to the will. This is a sworn affidavit from your mother-in-law, Eleanor Peterson. It details how you forcibly ejected her, the only other living member of the immediate Peterson family, from the home. It states that you instructed her to, and I am quoting directly from her statement, go die in a dumpster. Hearing my own story recounted in that sterile, legal setting, hearing her ugly words repeated back to her, felt like a final, somber validation. Chloe flinched as if he had struck her. The last of the color drained from her face. She looked from the folder to me and then to Mr. Davies, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had no defense. There was no lie she could tell that would be more powerful than the simple, documented truth. Mr. Davies leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. You see, Chloe, this first will wasn't just a legal document. It was a question. A question my client, your late husband, needed a definitive answer to. And the question was this: were you a worthy steward of his life's work? Were you a worthy protector of his family? I watched her as the terrible truth began to dawn. She wasn't a player in a financial game, she was the subject of a moral experiment, and she had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Your actions, Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense, provided the answer to that question with absolute clarity. Which leads me to a question of my own for you. He paused, letting the silence press down on her. Did you listen carefully to the entire will, Chloe? Did you pay attention to the words in Section 4, Subclause C? The small print. The part that describes the automatic and immediate activation of Codicil B in the event of a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty by the primary beneficiary? Her face was a blank mask of uncomprehending horror. She had heard only the $55 million. She had heard only the house. The rest had just been noise. Mr. Davies reached into the leather briefcase that sat beside his chair. I watched him, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He didn't pull out a thick legal binder or a stack of papers. He pulled out a single, elegant cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a circle of dark blue wax, impressed with the Peterson family signet ring, the one I had given David on the day he graduated from college. The lawyer placed the envelope in the exact center of the polished table. It sat there, a quiet, unassuming object that held the power of an earthquake. Chloe stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Mr. Davies folded his hands. This codicil, Chloe, legally voids the document we read last week in its entirety. This, he said, his voice resonating with the final, unassailable truth, is David's true and final will. Mr. Davies took a small silver letter opener from his desk set and slid it carefully under the blue wax seal. The sound of the paper tearing was a sharp, final rip in the silent room. He unfolded the single sheet of paper it contained. I saw my son's familiar, clear handwriting, and my breath caught in my chest. David's true intentions were not buried in pages of legal jargon, they were stated with a clarity that was both loving and ruthless. Mr. Davies placed the paper on the table and began to read, his voice the calm, steady instrument of my son's final command. This is codicil B to the last will and testament of David Peterson, he began. Activated this morning by the authority granted to my executor, it hereby renders all previous versions of this will null and void. The disposition of my estate is as follows. He looked directly at Chloe, whose eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her breath. 1. Davies read, all my assets, without exception, including all shares in Peterson AI, all financial portfolios, and the residential property at 114 Willow Creek Lane, are to be transferred immediately into a newly formed irrevocable trust, to be known as the Peterson Legacy Trust. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. 2. The sole trustee, manager, and administrator of the Peterson Legacy Trust will be my mother, Eleanor Peterson. I felt an immense, humbling weight settle on my shoulders. A duty. A purpose. 3. Davies continued, his voice unwavering. The primary mission of this trust will be to fund and oversee the David Peterson Tech Scholars Foundation, a charitable entity dedicated to providing technology and engineering education and scholarships to underprivileged children. A cause my son cared about deeply. And then, he came to the final provision. He looked at Chloe once more before reading it. 4. To my wife, Chloe Peterson, the trust will provide a monthly stipend of $2,000. He let that number hang in the air, a pathetic fraction of the millions she had tasted. This stipend is contingent upon her maintaining verifiable full-time employment. She will be permitted to reside, rent-free, in the guest cottage on the property. Any violation of these terms or any decision to cease working will result in the immediate and permanent termination of all financial support. It wasn't a punishment of pure poverty. It was, in its own way, so much worse for her. My son wasn't leaving her to starve, he was sentencing her to a life of ordinary, honest work, a life of responsibility, the very kind of life she had married him to escape. The color had completely vanished from her face, leaving a pale, waxy mask. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, as if trying to physically deny the reality of the words she was hearing. The $55 million empire, the sports car, the parties, the power, it had all been a fantasy, a week-long dream from which she was now having the cruelest awakening. As Mr. Davies neatly folded the single sheet of paper and placed it back in its envelope, the finality of the moment struck her. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and with a soft sigh, she slumped sideways out of her chair and collapsed onto the thick carpet in a dead faint. The great and powerful queen of the Peterson estate was gone. In her place was just a woman, unconscious on the floor of a lawyer's office, with a future she had single-handedly destroyed. My son's will had been done. 6 months passed, 6 months in which the world, for me, was not just rearranged but reborn. The silence of the motel room was replaced by the chaotic, wonderful noise of creation. The ghost who had been haunting the hallways of a past life had found a new and vibrant purpose. I was standing at a podium, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings in the air. I was wearing the same navy suit I had worn to Mr. Davies's office, but it no longer felt like armor for a confrontation. It felt like the uniform of a custodian, the proud guardian of a dream. I looked out not at a tense and hostile daughter-in-law, but at a room filled with the bright, hopeful faces of young students, the first graduating class of the David Peterson Tech Scholars Foundation. When I began to speak, my voice was strong and clear. Good morning, I said, a genuine smile on my face. My name is Eleanor Peterson, and I am my son's mother. I told them stories about David. Not about David the tech mogul, the millionaire, but about David the curious boy who took apart our family's only television set just to see how it worked, about David the determined young man who believed that the magic of technology shouldn't be a luxury for the rich but a tool for everyone with a dream. Many people will remember my son for the fortune he created, I told the crowd. But that fortune was never his goal, it was only a byproduct. His real dream, his true legacy, is this. I gestured around the room at the gleaming new computers, at the smart boards, at the eager faces of the children who would learn and create and build their own futures here. David believed that talent is universal, but opportunity is not, I continued. He wanted to build doors for those who had only ever been shown walls. So today, we are not just opening a building. We are continuing his most important work. We are fulfilling his true will, not the one written on paper, but the one that was written on his heart. As the room filled with warm, heartfelt applause, my thoughts drifted, just for a moment, to Chloe. I don't think of her with anger anymore. I rarely think of her at all. But I know where she is. My son's trust, in its quiet, methodical way, still keeps an eye on her. The image that came to my mind was of a different kind of room, a busy downtown coffee shop during the morning rush. Chloe was behind the counter, wearing a simple green apron with her name on a plastic tag. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was bare of the expensive makeup she used to wear. She moved with a practiced efficiency, frothing milk, calling out orders, wiping down the counter. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from standing on your feet for 8 hours. A customer was rude to her, complaining that his latte wasn't hot enough. I saw a flicker of the old fire in her eyes, a flash of indignation, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a weary resignation. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said, her voice flat. "I'll make you a new one." She had been sentenced to a life not of poverty but of consequence, a life of ordinary, honest work. And in her own quiet way, she was serving her sentence. A young girl, no older than 14, tugged on my sleeve, pulling me back to the present. She pointed excitedly at her computer screen, showing me a simple line of code she had written that made a cartoon dog wag its tail. Her eyes shone with pride and discovery. I smiled, a real smile that reached my own eyes. My sons will had created 2 new realities. For Chloe, a world of quiet consequence. For me, a world of noisy, chaotic, wonderful purpose. Justice, I've finally learned, isn't always found in a dramatic courtroom showdown. Sometimes it's in the quiet, steady, everyday work of building something better in the very space where something was broken. The library is my office now. My son's favorite room is no longer a silent sanctuary of memory but the bustling heart of his living legacy. The dark oak shelves are still here, but now they share space with whiteboards covered in plans and ideas. The air, once thick with the scent of old paper, now buzzes with the energy of a brighter future. I often sit at his old desk in the evening after the small, dedicated staff has gone home. On the corner of the desk is a photograph of David, taken on a hiking trip years ago. He is grinning, the sun in his eyes, the whole world at his feet. I look at it, and I feel no sorrow, only a quiet, profound pride. Justice, I've come to realize, isn't always a loud and thunderous affair. It doesn't always come with a gavel strike or a shouted verdict. Sometimes, justice is the quiet, satisfying click of a well-laid plan falling perfectly into place. My son didn't leave behind a pile of money, he left behind a legacy of passion and the belief that one person's success could be used to build a ladder for others. My purpose, my great honor, is to ensure that legacy breathes and grows every single day. In fulfilling my son's true will, I did more than just reclaim a house, I reclaimed myself. I found a reason to get up each morning that was bigger than my grief. I found my way back to the woman my son always knew I was. This story reveals that the most profound justice is often silent and strategic, not loud and vengeful. True strength lies not in immediate emotional reactions but in patience and foresight. David's ultimate victory wasn't in punishing his wife but in protecting his true legacy, one of purpose and charity over personal wealth. It teaches us that our real inheritance is the positive impact we create and the values we uphold. The most powerful response to arrogance is not anger, but the quiet execution of a well-laid plan that reestablishes order and honors what truly matters. Thank you for listening to my story. It has taught me that sometimes the most powerful action isn't a furious shout, but a quiet, carefully calculated move on the chessboard of life. If you agree, and if you have ever had to find strength in wisdom and patience, please share your thoughts. Your voice and your stories matter. Thank you for being a part of this journey.